So today we're going to spend some time looking at how we can find the product of two decimals by using partial products. So at the top of page 196 is this word problem where it says June walked 1.7 miles in 1 hour. If she walks at the same rate, how far is she going to walk in 1.5 hours? So when we are doing partial products is where I'm going to break my two numbers apart. I'm going to break them in this case apart by a whole number and my decimals, and then multiply to find my answer. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to build my box, and I'm going to break apart my values. So this first value I'm going to write my 1 here, and my ones place is going to go on the left side, and then I'm going to write my tenths on this side. And then on the right of the box, or on the left of the box, I'm going to write my next value, which is 1 and 5 tenths. So when I do 1 and 5 tenths, I'm going to go ahead and see what I get. So 1 times 1 is going to be 1. And then I'm going to multiply 1 times 7 tenths, which anything times 1 is itself. So it's going to be 7 tenths. Then I'm going to multiply this 1 right here by a fifth. So 1 times a half is going to be 5 tenths. And then I'm going to multiply 5 tenths by 7 tenths. And so if I just ignore the decimals and do 7 times 5, I'm going to get 35. Now, my hope is that yesterday when you guys were looking at your modeling, you were starting to notice a pattern. And that pattern is going to go back to what we did when we looked at multiplying a decimal by a whole number. Is here I have two values behind a decimal. So I have a 7 behind a decimal and I have a 5 behind the decimal. So here, if I have two values behind a decimal, then when I have 7 tenths multiplied by 5 tenths, I should have two values behind a decimal. So my answer here is going to be 35 hundredths. The other way that I can look at that is I took 7 times 5 and I got 35. Well, 7 tenths and 5 tenths are both 1 tenth. So 0.5 is 1 tenth of 5, and 0.7 is 1 tenth of 7. And so 35 hundredths needs to be, because I have a 1 tenth and a 1 tenth, 35 hundredths is going to be, going to get a little crazy over here. 35 hundredths is going to be 1/100th of 35, because 10 times 10 is 100. Okay, so I'm not done with the problem. What I need to do is I need to go ahead and I need to add my partial products together. So I want this to be as big as I can. And so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to list out my partial products, and then I'm going to add them together. So now I'm just going to simply add. So I'm going to add 1 plus 0.7 plus 0.5 plus 35 hundredths. And so when I add those together, I'm going to go ahead and use the commutative property to get values to be easy. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add my 7 tenths and 5 tenths first. So now I have 1 added to 1 and 2 tenths added to 35 hundredths. So 1 added to 1 and 2 tenths is going to be 2 and 2 tenths added to 35 hundredths, which is going to be 2 and 2 tenths added to 35 hundredths is going to be 2 and 55 hundredths. Well, 2 and 55 hundredths is close to the estimate of 4, so it's a reasonable answer. Okay, so let's take a look at the convince me. So I'm walking 1.7 miles, and this time I'm going to walk it in 2.8 hours. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to draw my square, and I'm going to break my values apart. So here I'm going to have 1.7, and on this side I'm going to do 2 and 8 tenths. And then I'm just going to multiply and see what I get. So 2 times 1 is going to be 2. 2 times 7 tenths. So 2 times 7 is going to be 14. So I'm going to write down 14. I have one number here behind the decimal, which means I should have one number behind the decimal in my product. 1 times 8 tenths is going to be 8/10 because anything times 1 is itself. And then 7 times 7/10 multiplied by 8/10. I'm going to just look at that as 7 times 8, which is 56. I have one number behind the decimal here, one number behind the decimal here. So 56, both values are going to be behind the decimal. And again, I'm hoping that that's something that you noticed yesterday when you're multiplying two decimals together. It was your basic math fact, but both values, your product, had both numbers behind the decimal. So there's my partial products. My partial products on this one is going to be 2, 1/4, 1 1/4, or 1 4/10, 8/10, and 56/100. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add these together. So I'm going to do 2 added to 1 4/10, added to 8/10, added to 56/100. So when I add those together, I'm going to start by adding 2 and 1 4/10. So I get 3 and 4/10 added to 8/10 added to 56/100. 3 and 4/10 added to 8/10. Well, 4 added to 8 is going to be 12. So now I have, I'm going to come over here. So now I have 4 and 2/10 added to 56/100, which is going to be 4 and 76/100. So there I'm going to have 4 and 76 miles in 2.8 hours. Alrighty, let's go ahead and let's take a look at your guided practice for today on page 197. All right, so number 1 says, how is multiplying two decimals different from multiplying one decimal by a whole number? So when we multiplied one decimal by a whole number, we only had to be concerned about this decimal value. So if I change it, let's do this. Let's make the 1. So if I did 3 times 5/10, I only had to be concerned about this value. So I could just ignore the decimal and I could do 3 times 5, which was 15. And then here I had one value behind the decimal. So I need to have one number behind the decimal in my product. But when I have a decimal multiplied by a decimal, I have to consider both numbers behind the decimal. So again, if I ignore the decimals, I have 3 times 15, or 3 times 5, which is 15. And then I have one value behind the decimal here and one value behind the decimal here. So both numbers in my product need to be behind the decimal. So that's what I look at when I'm doing that. I need to look at the decimal places of both decimals when I am multiplying two decimals together. All right, number 2. Carter is filling a 6.5 ounce bottle with salsa he made for gifts. So there's my first value, 6.5 ounces. He was able to fill 7.5 bottles. How many ounces of salsa did he make? So I have 6.5 multiplied by 7.5. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do my partial product. So this is what I expect to see with your partial products. I expect to see the square and I expect to see your values broken apart. So I'm going to do my whole numbers first. So I have 6 times 7. And then I'm going to do my 2/5. So 6.5. So I'm going to do 5/10 here. And then down here, I'm going to do 5/10 as well. So 7 times 6 is going to be 42. And then I'm going to multiply 7 times 5 is going to be 35. But I have one number behind the decimal. So I need to have one number behind the decimal here. And then, so now I'm all the way done doing multiplying by 7 across. I'm going to do 6 times a half. So, or 6 times 5, which is going to be 30. And then one number behind the decimal. So I have 3 as my answer. And now I'm going to multiply a half times a half. Well, 5 times 5 is 25. And then the pattern that I continue to use is that I look at how many numbers I have behind the decimal. So here I had, when I did 7 times 5, I had one number behind the decimal in my factor. So one number in my product. 6 times 5/10, one number behind the decimal. So one number behind in my product. So here I have 2 values behind my decimal. So I need to have 2 values behind in my product. So when I go to add these together, I'm going to have 42 added to 3.5 added to 3 added to 25 hundredths. And we're going to see what that equals. Well, 42 added to, I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to add 3.5 and 3. That's 6.5. So 42 added to 6.5 is going to be 48.5. And I'm going to add that 25 hundredths to it. And when I add 25 hundredths to it, I get 48 and 75 hundredths ounces. So I need to make sure that I'm including that unit of measurement. If you don't include your unit of measurement or your label, you are not getting the problem correct. So whenever they give you a unit of measurement, in this case ounces, you need to make sure that you are including ounces. All right, so let's take a look, and what we're going to do is we're going to do 9 3/10, and I'm going to multiply that by 4 1/10. So 9 3/10 multiplied by 4 1/10. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take this and I'm going to set it up as a partial product. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to estimate this time because I haven't been estimating. So I want to make sure that I do my estimations to check for reasonableness. So 9 3 3/10, that's going to become 9. 4 1/10 is going to become 4. So my answer should be near 36. Then I break it apart. So I have 9 3/10. So again, I'm breaking apart my decimals and just writing them in decimal notation. And 4 1/10. Okay, 4 times 9 is going to be equal to 36. 4 times 3/10, so I'm going to do 4 times 3, which is equal to 12. One value behind the decimal here, so one value behind the decimal in my product to get 1 2/10. 9 times 1/10 is going to be 0.9. I can just move the decimal one place to the left. And then 3 times 1/10, so 3 times 1 is 3, but I need to have two values behind the decimal. So it's going to be, I'm going to need to put a 0 in front and decimal. So I have 0 and 3/100 because 1/10 of 3 is 3/100. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add. So I'm going to do 36 added to 1 2/10. I'll just set this up over here on the side. So 36 added to 1 2/10 is going to be 37 2/10. And then here, 9 added to 3/100 or 9/10 added to 3/100 is going to be 93/100. And then I'm simply going to add. So 37 2/10 added to 0.93. So we need to put a decimal after the 2. So I end up with 3. 11, I regroup, put my decimal down. 7 and 1 is 8. So my answer is going to be 38 1/3. 38 1/3 is near 36. So it is a reasonable answer. I'm going to take a look at one more. So I'm going to do 3 2 6. 3 2/10 multiplied by 6/10. So 3 is going to round to 3. 6 is going to round to 1/2. And so my answer should be near 1 1/2. Build my partial product box. Go ahead and get it set up. 3 goes here. 2/10 goes here. I'm going to put a 0 here as a placeholder, and then 6/10 goes right there. So 3 times 0 is going to be 0. 0 times 2/10 is going to be 0. And then 3 times 6/10, well, 3 times 6 is going to be 18. And then I have one value behind the decimal, so I need to have one value behind the decimal there. And then 6/10 times 2/10, well, 6 times 2 is 12. And because I have 2 numbers behind the decimal, I need to have 2 numbers behind the decimal in my answer. So I'm going to add 1 8/10 added to 12/10. And when I do that, I end up with 1 92/100 as my answer. You guys are going to come get your 4-6 practice, and you are going to show your partial product steps on everything that you do on today's practice.